Hi friends, I hope all is well. Last month I made a lot of collages, so my supplies of painted papers is low. I decided to try a different technique than my usual, which is either monoprinting or hand painted papers. Neither require any prepping of the papers. You're watching me prep 60-pound paper with gesso. I'll be using Absorbent Ground, which requires this step. It needs to be applied to a porous ground. I decided to use 60-pound paper instead of my usual 80-pound paper because this technique has many layers. I didn't want the finished painted paper to be too thick. I prefer collage papers that are either thin or mid-weight so it's easier to glue. It's a personal preference. I'll finish prepping these papers off camera and then I'll come back to apply the absorbent ground and paint. If you haven't used absorbent ground before, it's used to get a stained watercolor effect when you apply paint on top of it. It has a consistency like cream and it's opaque white, and that's how it looks when it's dried. I'm applying it with a brush for this first paper so the surface is relatively smooth. This is the way I've seen it mostly applied. For the next paper, I want to try it with some sort of smoothing tool so it's applied unevenly. My plan is that the uneven surface will provide more variation of color and texture once the paint is applied on top. I will apply the absorbent ground with a brush on a few papers, then use the smoothing tool method on the others. I want to have a variety of papers with both surfaces. I'm using a thin promotional card similar to a gift card or a credit card. The edges have small ridges that I didn't notice until I started applying the absorbent ground. It's not the texture I wanted, so I switched to another piece of this promotional card that has smooth edges. I'm not sure it's easy to see, but I'm applying the absorbent ground so there's areas where it's thicker along with smooth areas. The thick and thin areas will help to create texture when I apply paint on top of it. I'm using fluid acrylic paint in yellow ochre for this first paper. You don't necessarily need to use fluid paint because whatever paint you're using needs to be watered down to get the best results. It's hard to describe the right amount of water to use. I suggest starting with a small amount and adding more if necessary. It's a bit of a trial and error process, especially if you're using different types of acrylic paint, fluid versus regular. I'll be using different types of acrylic paint in this video so you can see how each one works with this technique. I left this section of the video in real time so you can see the actual process. The rest of the video will be sped up just a bit. I'm applying the paint with a brush at first to get a good amount of it on the surface. If you're trying this technique for the first time, I suggest applying the paint in sections. Then take some sort of smoothing tool to drag the paint towards the area that doesn't have paint. You can see the paint being partially removed to reveal the stained look. Also, you see the areas where I build up the absorbent ground. This is one of the papers that I used the smoothing tool to apply the absorbent ground so the surface was uneven. With absorbent ground, it allows you to go back over the surface to remove or add more paint. This is a benefit of this technique. Sorry for the glare, the studio lights reflect on the wet surface. I will add an image of the finished dried paper so there won't be so much glare. I brought out another fluid acrylic paint, but in a darker color so you can see how it will be applied and look on the surface. Going forward, the video will be sped up a bit, but I did the same process of applying some of the paint, then spread it across the surface. I didn't get enough variation of color, so I went back in with a wet brush to add more water, then dragged the smoothing tool over the surface. I continued to do these steps until I got the variation of color and stained look that I wanted. I wanted to show you this technique using regular acrylic paint. I suggest using a bit more water than the amount used for fluid acrylic paint. Again, I reworked the surface by adding and removing paint and water. Besides using a brush or a smoothing tool to remove the paint, try using a shop towel. Each one will give a different look to the paper. Make sure it's a blue shop towel, not a regular paper towel. A regular paper towel will leave fibers on the surface. By the way, I started to use the end of a brush to hold the paper in place because my finger was leaving an imprint on the surface. That could be a cool look, but it's not one I wanted for this paper. After I painted a few more papers, I noticed a few didn't turn out stained or watercolor looking enough for my liking. I thought it'd be interesting to see if I could add more watered down paint on these papers to get the desired look. Both papers that I'm showing you in this section were made in this order: gesso, then the absorbent ground, then acrylic paint. I wasn't sure if I could get the stained watercolor look because the last layer is just watered down acrylic paint, but I wanted to give it a try. I'm using matte acrylic paint in teal green on top for contrast. Also, I wanted to test it to see how this type of acrylic paint would work with this technique. It's working well because it's giving the desired staining effect. This aqua painted paper doesn't look bad because it has texture, but it doesn't have the staining watercolor effect that I wanted. Not sure if it's the color because it's light, or is it the matte acrylic paint? But I used matte acrylic paint on the previous paper and it worked fine. I'm not sure. I started applying the paint as I did with the other papers. After I covered the surface with paint, I grabbed a bottle of water to see if I could apply the water in a light mist. Here I'm applying the water with a spray bottle. When I drag the smoothing tool, I get an interesting splatter effect. I decided to go over this section again to cover some of that effect, but I took note of it to try later. Painting on top of the previous two papers got me thinking, what would happen if I mixed the paint into the absorbent ground so this layer wouldn't be white? I had to be mindful of the paint color selection since it would lighten up when mixed with the absorbent ground, which is opaque white. I poured both into a cup instead of mixing it on a palette to make sure I had enough of this mixture to cover the paper, which I did, and some. I was able to use this same mixture to paint two other papers. I started with pink paint because it's a light color. This mixture was thick, so I had to make sure it was completely mixed together before applying it to the paper. I chose a gesso paper that had a smooth surface for this first try. Once the paper was dried, I decided to use this dark purple acrylic paint so there'd be enough contrast between the colors. I mixed in the water, then I applied the paint in sections. You can see right away that I'm getting the stained watercolor look with a hint of the pink underneath. I could have left the splattered watercolor effect, but I wanted to remove more of the purple paint to reveal more of the pink paint underneath it. I wanted this paper to have more of a stained look than a splattered water look. I decided to do the same technique for the next two papers with different color combinations. This next paper I mixed matte acrylic paint in Orange Deep with the Absorbent Ground. I'm applying burnt umber on top. I like this color combination, so I knew I wanted to make at least one paper with it. The consistency of the burnt umber didn't feel thin enough, so that's why I added more water, then went over it again with a shop towel to remove it. Then I went back in with a spray bottle with water to get the splattered effect. If the burnt umber was too thick, I doubt enough of the orange paint would have been visible after spraying it with water. I mixed in bright yellow into the absorbent ground for this next paper, then applied dark green paint over the top. This is another color combination that I like, so I wanted a paper for my supply. Instead of applying the green paint in sections, I decided to cover the whole surface at once because I'm spraying water on top of it to get that splattered effect. Since I'll use a smoothing tool and drag off the excess paint, it may save a step or two to cover the whole surface at once. I like the final paper. It's good to know that I can paint the whole surface at once if I want and still get a good looking painted paper. I wanted to take the last technique and take it a step further. This time I wanted to apply two different paint colors on top of the layers of paint and absorbent ground. This is a good example of letting the creative flow evolve. One process can lead to another. The first layer is a mixture of orange paint and absorbent ground. I wanted a subtle contrast for this first paper, so I chose two different red paints for the top layer. I'm applying these two paints in a loose ombre. I went back and forth with applying and removing the paints until I was happy with the final paper. These painting sessions are a time to create new painted papers, but also it's a time to play and to see how I can push a certain technique. The layers of gesso, absorbent ground, and paint strengthen the 60-pound paper, so it's possible to rework the surface without tearing it. I have another aqua ground layer paper that didn't turn out as I had hoped. I didn't mix the aqua paint with the absorbent ground, it was painted on top. I'm painting the teal green and dark blue to create a stripe pattern. There'll be a dark blue stripe at the top and the bottom of the paper with teal green paint in the middle. This will give me a bit more color variation when using it in a collage. I'm painting the whole surface and spraying water on top. I'll drag the smoothing tool horizontally to keep the colors in place. This is one of the papers that I applied the absorbent ground with a plastic card to get an uneven surface. You can see how this added a bit more texture. There's a lot going on with this paper. 3 colors in a stripe pattern, there's splatter effect, and uneven absorbent ground layer. This is the last paper I'm painting for this video. My initial idea was to paint a loose design with 2 colors. I wasn't sure how the finished paper would look, so I wanted to give it a try. It didn't turn out as I thought it would, but it did turn out to be a beautiful paper, so I wanted to leave it in the video to show you how workable this technique can be. I realized that after dragging the smoothing tool across the surface that I should have followed the shape of each color or just sprayed water first to get the splattered effect. As you can see, all the dragging with the smoothing tool was blending the colors together, losing the loose design. Fortunately, the colors blended nicely together. I came in with the spray bottle and mist the whole surface with water, then dragged the smoothing tool. In the end, I liked the final paper. I hope you learned something from this video. I encourage you to try making painted papers using absorbent ground. Also encourage you to play and explore different techniques in your art practice. In my next video, I'll be using these papers and collages, so watch out for that video. Thanks for watching. Take care.